He thought he was untouchable. That's the first thing I need you to know. My husband smiled at me across crowded rooms, kissed my cheek when people were watching, and built his whole reputation on being the reliable one, the loyal one. And for years I believed him. For years I stood by his side, holding down our home, managing bills, protecting his image, even sacrificing pieces of myself to keep the marriage intact. But then one email shattered it all. At first I didn't want to believe what I was seeing. A loan notice in my name for $85,000. A debt I never signed for, attached to a construction project in a part of town I'd never even set foot in. I remember my hands trembling as I scrolled, thinking maybe it was a scam. But no, the details were too precise. My name, my social security number, my credit on the line, and then, buried in the documents, a property deed. A house, not our house. Not a home for us or for our children. A brand new house in her name. His mistress. My stomach twisted. Every sleepless night, every shift I'd worked overtime, every bill I'd stretched to cover, all while he was funneling money under my identity to build another woman a future. He thought he was clever, that I'd stay quiet, that no one would ever know. But he underestimated me, because when the truth came out, it wasn't behind closed doors. It wasn't whispered in anger. I took the microphone, and I ended it live. I didn't scream when I first realized it. Though every part of me wanted to, I didn't throw plates or call him in blind rage. I sat there staring at the glow of the laptop screen with this cold, detached stillness settling over me because in that moment something broke. Not just my trust, but this quiet illusion I had built around my marriage. This belief that even if we had flaws, we were still working toward the same life, the same goals, the same home. But no, the man I had loved for years had decided that my name and my credit were convenient tools, disposable assets he could leverage for his secret life. And the longer I looked through the files, the clearer it became. There were invoices dated 6 months back, permits signed under forged signatures that eerily mimicked mine, contractors who had already been paid. It was all meticulous, well planned, and he had carried it out under my nose while kissing me goodnight and telling me not to stress about money because he had it covered. The audacity made my chest tighten, and yet even then I didn't run to confront him. Instead, I dug deeper. I printed everything. I went through his emails. I tracked the transactions. And each page I uncovered told the same story. My husband had stolen $85,000 under my name to build a house that wasn't for us but for her. A woman I hadn't even known existed until that night. Her name scribbled on a utilities setup form, her address matching the new property. And with every confirmation, the betrayal sharpened like glass in my veins. I thought about all the times I had clipped coupons to make our grocery budget work. The Christmas where I quietly sold my grandmother's necklace just to cover presents for his nieces and nephews. The trips I said no to because we needed to be responsible, all while he was laying bricks and pouring foundations for his mistress. And I thought about the silence he had demanded from me whenever I asked about the accounts. The way he brushed off my questions with a smirk, telling me not to worry my pretty head about numbers, as though financial control was just another layer of his authority over me. Well, that night I decided I wasn't just going to take it to him privately. I wasn't going to argue behind closed doors where he could spin his lies and twist his stories. No, I wanted this truth to echo, to be undeniable. And that seed of an idea grew quickly. The microphone. The one thing he couldn't talk over, couldn't mute, couldn't twist into his narrative, because when the truth came from my mouth publicly, when people heard the receipts spoken aloud, he wouldn't just lose me. He would lose everything he thought he could protect by keeping me silent. The next day, I played the role. I smiled at him over breakfast. I kissed his cheek as though nothing had changed, but my heart was pounding with the weight of what I knew. Because I had already decided I would not be his quiet victim. I would not be the dutiful wife who quietly picks up the pieces while he builds castles for someone else. I would use my voice, I would use the documents, and I would strip him of the one thing he cherished more than money: his image, his reputation, his carefully curated facade of success and loyalty. I wasn't going to simply confront him. I was going to destroy the mask he wore in front of everyone we knew. And by the time the opportunity arrived, by the time the microphone was in my hand and the audience was listening, there was no turning back, because this story wasn't going to end with me being silenced. It was going to end with his world collapsing around him in real time while everyone watched. I already knew I would need a stage. It wasn't bravado so much as strategy. If I wanted to make sure he couldn't gaslight, couldn't charm his way out with that practiced half smile, I had to choose a place where the lie would have no corners to hide in, and where his audience would be the same people who trusted him most. He loved his little appearances. The neighborhood fundraiser where he gave charming speeches about community and family, the Chamber of Commerce gala where he stood under warm lights, and everyone nodded as if he'd said something profound. So I signed us up as volunteers for the spring benefit, the event where he always wore his navy blazer and people said, "What a solid man." I spent a week getting my story in order. But more importantly, I spent a week turning paperwork into a script. Bank transfers printed with timestamps, wire confirmations with contractor names, a notarized statement from the project manager who confirmed that half the payments came from an account opened with my information, emails where he forwarded invoices with "Pay under Vanessa" in the subject line, and a ledger where he had recorded cash draws labeled in his messy handwriting, House A. I had it all organized in a binder that looked like the kind of professional file a lawyer would carry, and I taped a copy of the deed where she was named as an owner right in the front, so there would be no reading between the lines when I lifted it up that night. I practiced the arc of my voice until it didn't tremble, opening calm, then rising with facts, then cutting cold with the conclusion. I booked the mic slot under community remarks and pretended to be nervous so no one would suspect I was about to pull the rug out from under them. The day arrived and everything was a study in small betrayals. He kissed me on the cheek before he walked onto the stage, that same patronizing kiss where he whispered, "You okay?" Like he needed to be reassured his little secret wouldn't leak. I sat in the third row with the binder on my lap, my fingers tracing the cover until the moment felt inevitable. His mistresses never wore a name tag at our parties, but that night she was there, seated at a table 3 rows back from the dais, looking carefully neutral like a woman who had rehearsed being unseen. The room smelled like lemon cleaner and perfume and success. People clapped for his speech about growing together, and he smiled like a man who thought he was safe. When the MC called for community remarks, I walked to the mic as if I were stepping into a small, respectable role. I introduced myself, I thanked the organizers, and then, with people leaning in because they'd seen me at his side for 10 years, I opened the binder and read the first line out loud. My name is Vanessa Cole. On March 12th, I discovered an $85,000 loan taken out under my name for the construction of a property at 421 Westbrook Lane. The sound of my words filled the room, crisp, factual, impossible to fold into charm. I started slow, reading dates and reference numbers, the names of contractors, the amount wired on specific days, and I didn't look at him when I read the first line that named her. Instead, I watched the way the chandelier light hit the tablecloths, like markers on a map. At the deed in her name, the room's hum shifted to a tangible silence. Forks paused. Cell phones were raised like little accusatory flags. And somewhere at the back, a woman gasped. He stood there frozen for a heartbeat, and then the practiced mask tightened. He attempted the charming recovery. The laugh he always used when people got uncomfortable, but the sound died before it finished because I produced the email where he'd asked a contractor to make sure it's paid under Vanessa, keep receipts clean, and the MC's smile cracked and disappeared. He started toward me sideways as if approaching an animal, mouth moving. Vanessa, this is... But I held up a copy of the bank statement and read the wire transfer line aloud. Paid to H Construction. March 2, $25,000. Paid to H Construction. April 8th, $40,000. Paid to H Construction. May 3rd, $20,000. Every chunk of money had my name attached in small print on the account application. I said their names into the microphone so everyone could hear. Contractor, property, Mistress's name. And when I said her name, the woman at the back reached up and ripped her name tag off, her face as white as the table linen. Phones were out now recording. Someone asked him a question from the crowd, and his answer looked like a man trying to translate a foreign word he didn't understand. He stammered about a misunderstanding, about business accounts, about paperwork mistakes, but I had the receipts. The sworn statement from the contractor who had taped a photo of the foundation with a note. Paid by Vanessa account per client's request. I had the text where he told her, "Don't worry, I used her credit line." And I read that too. The room, which had been full of polite nods, now hummed like a disturbed hive. He moved closer and tried to take the binder out of my hands, but I didn't let him. Instead, I opened the last page where there was a scanned copy of the deed and the mortgage application, and I said in a low voice so the entire hall could hear, "This house was not for our family. This house was for her." He lunged then, the hand that had so often been gentle now frantic, and he shoved at the lectern as if by knocking it over he could erase every PDF and signature I'd held up. A man from the board stepped between us and I felt his fingers dig into my elbow. Later he would tell me he didn't know if he was saving me or saving us both from a physical fight. Phones were recording everything. The binders, his face, the way he mouthed the words I didn't. The color draining from him like someone had unclipped a hidden bulb. After I finished reading, I didn't beg for belief. I didn't plead. I laid out what I wanted with the same clear cadence. To our bank, to the police, and to anyone who was offering him rhetorical shelter that night, the truth. I told them I'd filed a fraud claim, and I had copies of every transaction. I told them I'd transferred the mortgage paperwork to my attorney, and that I expected banks to freeze accounts that were opened under my name without my consent. The sound of my voice saying, "I've filed a report," was small, but the consequence of that sentence was huge. He tried to speak into the microphone after me, tried to smile and explain and charm, but the room had already shifted allegiance. His friends looked as if they'd been holding their breath and finally realized the air was toxic. Cameras panned toward the woman in the back, and within an hour the video of me reading the emails had been clipped and uploaded. By midnight, his phone was ringing with numbers he didn't recognize. By morning, 3 local news outlets had snippets, and by afternoon, his law partners were asking for a meeting he could not charm his way out of. He called me that night. 1,000 apologies wrapped in a man who thought if he said the right words, everything could be sewn back together. I answered once and told him calmly, "You stole from me. You used my name to buy her a house. I want the money back, and I want your lawyer to be the one to tell me how you plan to fix this." He asked me not to go to the police. He said he'd make it right. I recorded the call. The next morning, the first invoice from the contractor arrived in my inbox with a note. "We received final payment from an account. Linked to Vanessa Cole. Please advise." I forwarded that to my attorney and then to the woman whose face had gone white. In the crowd, not in anger but because I wanted her to hear the truth. From the woman who had owned the account she now lived in. The messages that followed from her were shock and then silence, then a demand that he explain. He tried to spin it into a romance story she could sympathize with, lies about being trapped, lies about intention. But the bank statements didn't care about intent. Social media didn't care about intent either. People lined up to take sides, and his carefully curated image, the public version of him that had held like varnish for years, began to flake away. There were consequences I couldn't have predicted. An investor pulling out, a local sponsor rescinding a donation, mutual friends distancing as if the betrayal were contagious. But I had always wanted him to feel both the private and public cost of using my life like collateral. I wasn't satisfied with his small apologies. I wanted restitution and accountability, and the kind of structural undoing that would prevent him from ever doing the same again. So while he scrambled to hire a PR person to restore his brand and to whisper to the contractors to backdate or fix paperwork, I worked with a fraud investigator who traced every wire, with a lawyer who filed for immediate freeze orders on accounts opened under my identity, and with a forensic accountant who turned his messy ledgers into a timeline that was cruel in its clarity. The house on Westbrook Lane was put under temporary hold pending inquiry. His credit access was limited, and when the Mistress, who by then knew everything, tried to protect him in a public post about difficult decisions, commenters pasted screenshots of the emails I'd read from the stage. He sat across from me at the kitchen table 2 weeks after the event, looking like a man with every tool he had once used to control me bluntly removed, and he said, "Why did you have to make it public?" I put my coffee down and said, "Because you thought you'd get away with it." He looked away then, the only real thing he'd ever been honest about with me. Fear. The rest of the story involved lawyers and bank holds and awkward board meetings and small humiliations in front of people who once toasted him, but it also involved me learning the price of self-respect. Sleepless nights spent combing through invoices for small, hidden transactions. Conversations with my mother where I finally told her the truth without apologizing for the way I'd let things slide. An offer to move in with a friend while the house we owned together was examined for liens. The revenge I had in mind wasn't theatrical ruin so much as surgical correction. Legal claims for the money, public truth for the reputation, and a final private step to ensure he couldn't hide behind me again. But just when I thought the plan had reached its turning point, a new document arrived that complicated everything. A notarized statement from an accountant claiming he had been in communication with both of us about investments, a line that suggested I might not have been entirely uninvolved, a small shadow thrown across the bright clarity I had worked so hard to create. It was the sort of wrinkle that would make people whisper, "Maybe it's complicated," and give him an opening. I saved that document too, because I had learned to expect mud and to be ready to show how it smeared. The case was far from closed, the news cycle relentless, and the person who had once looked at me with comfortable possession now watched me with the primitive fear of someone being stripped of their illusions. I had taken the mic and ended the comfortable lie, but the real work, the forensic undoing of what he'd built on top of my name, was only just beginning. And in the months that followed, every time he tried to rebuild, I'd show another receipt, another call log, another confirmation number, until the scaffolding of his secret life had nowhere left to stand. By the time week 3 rolled around after the fundraiser, the storm he thought would blow over had only deepened. I was living in our house like it was a staging ground, folders stacked on the dining table, voicemail after voicemail from banks and lawyers queued up on my phone. He had stopped coming home every night, sometimes slipping in after midnight with the same hollow excuses. Late meeting, emergency call. But I didn't press him anymore. I didn't need to. Every step he took outside that door seemed to be a scramble to contain the fire I'd already let loose, and each scramble only left more tracks. He thought he was clever by calling contractors to renegotiate statements. But I had already spoken with 2 of them, calmly, deliberately, and both agreed to forward me their correspondence in case things got messy. They knew whose signature was forged. They knew who signed off on the checks. They weren't going to jail for him. He tried, too, to spin the mistress back into his corner, painting me as vindictive, emotional, claiming I'd blown things out of proportion. But she had eyes, and she had already been burned once by believing his lines. The house he'd built for her was now radioactive, mortgage frozen, title in question, and her name splashed across the same social feeds that once admired his devotion. She texted me late one night. "I didn't know he used your name. I don't want anything that came from that. I'm done." I stared at the screen, feeling nothing but an odd clarity. She wasn't my ally, but she was his problem unraveling. The man who once strutted into rooms with confidence now walked with hunched shoulders, sunglasses indoors, desperate to avoid whispers. Meanwhile, my attorney had filed the fraud case officially, attaching everything I'd read aloud at the mic plus new documents we'd uncovered. A forged notary stamp, a falsified pay stub with my employer's name misspelled, a laughable attempt at paperwork that screamed his arrogance more than his intelligence. I didn't yell at him, didn't cry in front of him. I simply slid the copies across the table one morning and said, "This is going to court. You should prepare." His face drained of color, then hardened into anger. But anger didn't scare me anymore. It looked too much like weakness. He muttered about ruining him, about how I could have kept it private, about how no one needed to know. And I just stared at him and said, "You made it public the moment you used my name." The silence after was heavier than any argument. He left, slamming the door, and I realized I didn't care where he was going. His power was unraveling. His reputation was in free fall, and all I had to do was keep showing the receipts, keep holding the line, until there was nothing left of the empire he built on my back but ashes. The hearings came faster than either of us expected, because once the fraud division saw the stack of paperwork I'd given them, they didn't drag their feet, they moved. Subpoenas went out, contractors were called, and suddenly the polished man who once charmed bankers was sitting in a courthouse hallway with his lawyer whispering urgently into his ear. I sat across from him with my attorney, calm, binder in hand, and for the first time in years I felt taller than him. He wouldn't meet my eyes, only muttered under his breath, "You didn't have to do this." I almost laughed at the irony. He had stolen $85,000 of my credit, risked my future, and built a house for a woman who wasn't me, and yet somehow in his mind I was the one who crossed the line. Inside the courtroom, everything was fact, not feeling. They read out the account numbers, the false applications, the notary stamp traced back to a printer in his office. A forensic specialist showed how his IP address matched the online submissions. My name was all over the documents, yes, but so were his fingerprints, literally. One form had smudges where he'd signed with a shaky pen. He kept shifting in his chair, sweat shining on his temple, and every time his lawyer objected, the judge cut them down with a tone that made it clear the evidence was too strong. When the mistress was called as a witness, I thought she might lie for him, but she didn't. She admitted he told her the money was taken care of, and that I wouldn't even notice. She said she regretted ever believing him, and when she left the stand, she didn't even glance at him. By then, the gallery was buzzing. Neighbors, former colleagues, people who once praised him now whispering about his arrogance, his fall. My revenge wasn't loud screaming or broken glass. It was this quiet, relentless unfolding of truth in a place where charm couldn't erase signatures. He tried one last tactic, pulling me aside in the hall during recess. His voice was low, pleading. "Vanessa, if you drop this, I'll sign over the house. I'll put everything back. No one else has to know more than they already do." I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Everyone already knows, and I'm not dropping anything." His jaw clenched. His eyes darted to the reporters outside the window, and for the first time I saw what he really feared. It wasn't jail. It wasn't even losing me. It was the public humiliation of being seen for what he was. When the hearing closed that day, the judge froze all accounts tied to the fraudulent loans and set a date for formal charges. He walked out flanked by his lawyer, shoulders slumped, while I walked out with my head high, the binder under my arm like a weapon that had already done its damage. By the next morning, his photo was on the local news site. Prominent businessman accused of identity fraud. He had built his entire identity on appearances, and I had torn it down by simply telling the truth, page by page, microphone first, courtroom second. That night, sitting alone at my kitchen table, I poured a glass of wine and realized he thought he'd silenced me forever. But I had found my voice and I wasn't done using it. The day of his arrest didn't feel cinematic. It felt procedural, almost cold in how quickly it happened. 2 officers knocked on the door of his office just after lunch, in full view of his staff and a handful of clients who were waiting in the lobby. They read him his rights, cuffed him right there while people whispered and fumbled with their phones, recording as the man who once walked those halls like a king was marched out like a criminal. I didn't need to be there to see it. Someone sent me the clip within minutes, and by evening it was circulating on social media with captions that stripped away any veneer of dignity. Local businessman charged with fraud against his wife. Stole $85K to build Mistress a house. Each headline cut deeper into the reputation he had worshipped, and I didn't shed a single tear. The business partners who once toasted him now called me directly, not out of kindness but self-preservation. They wanted to know how far the investigation would go, whether their money was clean, whether they'd be implicated. I answered their questions calmly, binder open in front of me, because I had already given everything to the investigators. There were no secrets left to hide. Meanwhile, the house on Westbrook Lane stood unfinished, a skeleton of beams and drywall, a monument to his arrogance. The mistress had long since disappeared, her name now cursed as often as his, but I didn't care about her anymore. She was just another piece of collateral damage in the wake of his selfishness. What mattered was that the fraud charges stuck, that the accounts were frozen, that every step he took from this point forward would be shadowed by the truth I had dragged into the light. He called me from county lockup, voice cracked, trying to play the part of the broken man. "Vanessa, please, I can't survive this. Just tell them it was a mistake." I listened in silence, and when he paused, I said only, "It wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. And now you live with it." Then I hung up. For the first time in our marriage, the silence that followed belonged to me. That was the turning point, not just his downfall, but my freedom. I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like a woman who had been underestimated, who had taken the mic, shown the receipts, and refused to back down until justice was loud enough to drown out his lies. The fallout spread like wildfire, touching every corner of his carefully constructed world. Clients who once trusted him with their investments withdrew overnight. Partners scrambled to distance themselves, and within a month, his business license was suspended pending further investigation. Reporters camped outside his office, snapping photos of boxes being hauled out by junior employees who looked ashamed to even be carrying his logo. His family, who had once praised me for being the perfect supportive wife, now flooded my phone with calls, half begging me to fix this for their son, half accusing me of destroying the family's name. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I let their words wash over me like background noise because the truth was already public. And their denial meant nothing against court filings stamped in black ink. At home, the house we had shared became a museum of lies. His suit still hung in the closet, his cologne lingered in the air, but I stopped treating those things like sacred relics. I bagged them up piece by piece, not in rage but in resolve. Each shirt folded into silence. Each tie dropped into a box like evidence of a role he'd never play again. The neighbors whispered when they saw me moving bags to the car, but I met their glances with a steady calm. Let them talk. Let them piece together the story. The truth was already bigger than their gossip. Court updates came weekly now. My attorney handed me copies of motions, restitution, asset division, protective orders. Every page I signed felt like chiseling away the last chains he had wrapped around me. He tried to stall, to claim mental strain, to delay hearings, but the judge wasn't sympathetic. The fraud was clear, the trail undeniable. Each delay only made him look weaker, more desperate. And every time he tried to call me, I let it ring. My silence was louder than his pleas. One evening, I drove past the house on Westbrook Lane, the one he had stolen my name to build. It was quiet, unfinished, surrounded by weeds pushing through the dirt where a lawn was meant to be. Windows stood untrimmed, the roof half-shingled, a hollow skeleton of a dream he thought he could hide. I sat there in my car staring at it, and for the first time I didn't feel anger. I felt closure. That house wasn't mine, wasn't hers. It was his monument to arrogance, and now it would rot under his name in court records, not mine. At 60% of this story, I was no longer the woman he could silence, no longer the wife who clipped coupons while he stole behind my back. I had become the woman with the receipts, the woman who spoke into the microphone, the woman who refused to bend even when the whole family begged. And as his empire collapsed into ashes, I found myself standing taller, freer, ready to carve a future where my name meant only what I chose it to mean. By the time autumn came, the collapse was complete. His parents had stopped pretending they could shield him, their own accounts under scrutiny after investigators traced a handful of suspicious transfers that tied back to family businesses. His siblings, once smug and dismissive toward me, now avoided eye contact in public, knowing that anyone who bore his last name was tainted by association. He tried to convince them it was all a misunderstanding, but the evidence was undeniable, and every hearing drove another nail into the coffin of his reputation. I didn't shout in triumph. I didn't need to. Watching his empire crumble was satisfaction enough. His office building, once bustling with employees, now sat dark, foreclosure notices taped to the glass doors. The Westbrook Lane house was seized as part of the fraud investigation, its unfinished skeleton a permanent scar on the neighborhood. The mistress had moved away, vanishing into another city, her silence louder than any denial. And him. He was reduced to a man who shuffled between courtrooms and temporary housing, stripped of everything but excuses. Meanwhile, I rebuilt. I transferred our shared accounts into my sole name, with full court approval. I refinanced the house I chose to keep, the one that carried my memories but no longer his shadow. I returned to work with my head high, colleagues quietly congratulating me for surviving what most women would never dare to make public. And for the first time in years, I breathed without checking over my shoulder. He cornered me one last time outside a hearing. His face was gaunt, eyes hollow, voice low with something between desperation and hatred. "You've destroyed me, Vanessa," he hissed, as though he still believed he could cast himself as the victim. I looked at him steady, unshaken, and answered, "No, you destroyed yourself. I just stopped covering it up." He flinched like the truth had cut deeper than any knife. By the 65% mark of this story, the man who once believed he was untouchable had nothing left. No business, no mistress, no reputation, not even the illusion of control. And I, the woman he thought he could use in silence, walked away stronger, freer, and determined never to let anyone write my story under my name again. The final judgment came on a gray morning, the kind where the courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and coffee, the kind of day that felt heavy but inevitable. I sat in the front row with my attorney while he shuffled in wearing the same wrinkled suit he'd recycled for months, the one that hung loose now because stress had carved him thin. The judge read the findings slowly, methodically, stripping away the last defenses he'd tried to cling to. Fraudulent use of my identity, restitution owed in full, joint assets divided under my favor due to egregious misconduct. The Westbrook Lane house was officially seized by the state. His accounts were frozen permanently, and he was ordered to pay damages, not just the stolen $85,000, but legal fees, penalties, and interest that pushed the figure into 6 digits. He winced with every word, each ruling another crack in the armor he'd once worn so smugly. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I sat with stillness, letting the sound of his downfall settle into my bones like quiet justice. His lawyer tried to argue hardship, begged for leniency, but the judge wasn't moved. Choices have consequences, and his were written all over the receipts I had carried like a shield. When the gavel fell, it wasn't just the end of the case. It was the end of him as the man he pretended to be. Outside, reporters swarmed, microphones shoved in my direction, questions flying. How does it feel? Do you think justice was served? I answered only once, calm and clear. He used my name to build a life with someone else. Today, I took my name back. Then I walked past the cameras, past the chaos, into the quiet air of freedom. In the weeks that followed, I closed accounts, signed papers, and cut ties with precision. His family tried one last campaign of guilt, but I blocked their numbers. My peace wasn't theirs to negotiate. The house I kept began to feel lighter, freer, as though the walls themselves exhaled once his shadow was gone. I repainted the kitchen, tore down the curtains he liked, bought myself a new bed, and slept alone for the first time in years, without nightmares of forged signatures and stolen futures. At 70% of this story, the revenge wasn't about rage anymore. It was about boundaries, about dignity, about walking away with my head high while he drowned in the ruins of his lies. He thought the microphone would hum with his voice forever. But I was the one who held it last, and I used it to make sure the world knew the truth. By the time months had passed and winter set in, the dust had settled for everyone but him. His name became shorthand for betrayal in our town, whispered in grocery aisles, dissected over dinner tables, replayed in offices whenever someone mentioned trust and contracts. People didn't say his business collapsed. They said he pulled a Westbrook. His reputation wasn't just damaged, it was gone. a cautionary tale carved into local memory. And me, I was no longer the quiet shadow beside him. I was the woman who had stood in front of hundreds, microphone in hand, binder open, and told the truth without flinching. That identity stuck harder than any gossip his family tried to spin. I started building my own future, brick by brick, this time under my name alone. I opened a new account, clean and untouched by his fraud. I sold off what I didn't need, invested in myself, and walked into meetings without anyone looking past me to find him. The confidence felt unfamiliar at first, like a new pair of shoes, but soon it became second nature. Friends who once pitied me now admired me. Women reached out with messages like, "You gave me courage to leave," or "You proved we don't have to stay silent." My story was no longer just mine. It had become a spark for others who had been silenced. He, meanwhile, was living like a ghost, out on bail, under strict conditions, waiting for sentencing. No one returned his calls, his family visited less and less, and the mistress who once believed his promises refused to even answer the door. He tried reaching me again, a desperate letter scrawled on lined paper from his temporary apartment. "You were my whole world. Please stop." I read it once, folded it neatly, and slipped it into a drawer I never opened again. His words no longer had power. At 85% of this story, I wasn't just free of him. I was thriving in the very spaces he once told me I wasn't strong enough to stand in. He thought he could steal my name to build her a house. Instead, I rebuilt my entire life, and every brick carried my name alone. His downfall was public and permanent, but my revenge was quiet, steady, and unstoppable, living better, stronger, untouched by the ruins he left behind. The sentencing hearing was packed, every bench filled with faces who once admired him and now came to watch the fall of a man they barely recognized. The air was thick with whispers, the shuffle of papers, the flash of cameras through the doors. He stood at the defendant's table, thinner than ever, suit hanging like it belonged to someone else. His lawyer tried one last plea, a good man, a family man, a mistake made under pressure. But the words slid off the walls like water. The prosecutor laid it all out again, cold and clinical. 85,000 stolen under my name, forged documents, repeated deception, a mistress installed in a house he never finished. When the judge spoke, there was no softness in his tone. Fraud, identity theft, restitution, probation with jail time if payments were missed. The order was clear. Every cent repaid, my credit cleared, legal protections locked in so he could never touch my name again. His shoulders caved under the weight of it, and for the first time I saw the truth in his eyes. Not arrogance, not anger, but fear. Then came his chance to speak. He turned, shaky hands gripping the podium, and faced me across the courtroom. His voice cracked. "Vanessa, I'm sorry. I lost myself. I loved you. He broke off, searching for words that might undo what everyone had already seen. But apologies don't erase receipts. Regret doesn't rebuild trust. I kept my gaze steady, not cruel, just unmoved. He wanted me to cry, to show softness, but there was nothing left in me for him to hold on to. The judge cut him short, gavel striking once. And that was it. The final line of his story as my husband. Stamped and filed in records that would follow him longer than any marriage certificate. Outside, the crowd swarmed again. Reporters called my name, cameras followed me down the courthouse steps, and I answered once, clearly for all of them. Justice isn't revenge. Justice is truth. And today, the truth won. The microphones lowered after that, as though even they knew the story was no longer his. It was mine. The weeks that followed were quiet in comparison, but no less significant. Checks began arriving, restitution payments court-ordered, his wages garnished before they ever reached his account. I watched the money flow back, not with greed but with satisfaction. Each transfer was proof that I had reclaimed what he tried to steal. My attorney sent me updates, confirming my credit had been restored, my record untarnished. I was free not only emotionally, but legally, financially, wholly. And yet, in that quiet, I also felt the shift of something bigger. Women reached out to me, neighbors, coworkers, even strangers online who had seen clips of me at the mic, binder in hand, voice steady. They said my story gave them courage, gave them language for their own battles. I hadn't planned to become a symbol, but I realized that was its own kind of power. He had tried to erase me under paperwork. Instead, I had become louder than he ever imagined. At 90% of this story, the arc was almost complete. He stood stripped, sentenced, living in the ruins of choices he couldn't charm his way out of. And me, I was stepping into a life that was fully mine for the first time, not borrowed, not stolen, not silenced. But there was still one more chapter, one more reflection, one last act of closure before I could call this story finished. I didn't realize how heavy the silence had been until it was gone. For years, my life had been filled with the sound of him, his orders, his excuses, his rehearsed affection that always came with conditions. When it all ended, what I heard most was peace. Real peace. Waking up in my own house, walking through rooms that no longer felt like a stage for his performances, but a sanctuary for me. I painted the walls lighter, threw open the curtains he always kept closed, and for the first time in a long time, the air in my home didn't feel borrowed. It felt like mine. The months after the sentencing brought their own rhythm. I went back to work, not as someone's wife, not as someone's accessory, but as myself. My colleagues respected me in a new way because I had stood up publicly in a way most people never dare. Women whispered to me in hallways, slipped me notes, sent me emails late at night. I saw your video. You gave me the courage to speak. Their words humbled me more than any applause in a courtroom. I realized my revenge had never been about humiliating him. It had been about reclaiming myself, and maybe giving other women a spark to do the same. He faded into the background, as men like him do when their lies no longer feed them. His name became an afterthought in the news, just a headline archived in digital ink. People stopped asking about him, stopped connecting me to his mistakes. I was no longer his wife. I was Vanessa Cole, a woman who had rebuilt her life on her own terms. And that was the sweetest revenge of all. He had stolen my name, tried to bury it under debt and deception, and yet I had made it louder than ever, stronger than ever, untouchable by his hands. Sometimes I drive past the Westbrook Lane house, now auctioned off, a half-finished husk of wood and drywall weathering in the wind. I don't feel bitterness when I see it. I feel clarity. That house isn't a monument to betrayal anymore. It's a reminder of what arrogance builds and what truth destroys. It reminds me that I was never the weak one, never the blind one. I was simply waiting for the moment I would pick up the microphone and refuse to put it down. Now my life is quieter, fuller, steadier. I read more, I cook for myself, I take long walks without checking my phone for his excuses. Peace is not glamorous, but it is priceless. And every night I sleep soundly knowing he can never touch my name, my credit, my life, or my voice again. He thought he'd stolen $85,000 to build another woman a house. What he really built was my freedom, and I walked out stronger than he will ever be. So tell me, ladies, if you discovered your husband had stolen your name, your future, to build a life with someone else, would you have taken the mic too or walked away in silence?